welcome to Tales in the Dark. I know many of you enjoy relaxing with these videos, so I recommend turning down the volume until my voice is barely audible. It'll make the experience even more soothing. Before you close your eyes, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you and enjoy listening. Story 1. The antique grandfather clock in the foyer struck midnight, its deep resonant chimes echoing through the empty halls of the old villa. I sat in the library, surrounded by leather-bound books whose spines had long since faded to gentle shades of burgundy and forest green. The warm glow of my reading lamp created a small island of light in the vast darkness, while outside, autumn rain tapped a gentle rhythm against the window panes. I had inherited this place from my grandmother just 2 weeks ago. The lawyer's letter arrived unexpectedly, bringing news of both her passing and this peculiar inheritance. I had no memory of her ever mentioning a villa, yet here I was, surrounded by generations of collected memories that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. The rain's steady percussion was occasionally interrupted by the soft creaking of old wood, as though the house itself was settling into sleep. A worn leather armchair embraced me, its material butter-soft from years of use. The scent of old paper, beeswax polish, and something else, perhaps lavender or dried roses, filled my nostrils with each breath. In my lap lay an old photo album, its pages yellowed and slightly curled at the corners. Each photograph seemed to hold a fragment of a story I couldn't quite grasp. The faces looking back at me wore clothes from another era, their expressions caught between smiles and something more contemplative. Some of them resembled people I knew, yet the names written beneath in faded ink belonged to strangers. As I turned another delicate page, a loose photograph slipped out and drifted to the floor. When I retrieved it, the image made me pause. A young woman stood in this very library, wearing a dress that could have been from the 1940s. Her face was turned slightly away from the camera, but something about her profile tugged at my memory. She held a book in her hands, and behind her, the same grandfather clock that still stood in the foyer showed exactly midnight. The longer I stared at the photograph, the more details emerged. A pearl necklace at her throat caught the light. The book in her hands appeared to be bound in deep blue leather. But what truly caught my attention was her reflection in the window behind her. It seemed somehow different from her actual figure, as though caught in a separate moment of time. Setting the photo album aside, I found myself drawn to the library's expansive shelves. My fingers trailed along the spines until they stopped at a particular volume bound in blue leather. The sensation that rippled through me was like déjà vu, but stronger, more insistent. As I pulled the book from its resting place, a slight current of cool air brushed past my face, carrying with it the distinct scent of pearl powder and lavender perfume. The book's pages were blank, yet as I held it, the weight felt wrong for an empty volume. Turning it over in my hands revealed a small compartment crafted into the spine, disguised with remarkable skill. Inside lay a delicate key made of tarnished silver, its design matching no lock I had yet encountered in the villa. Night after night, I found myself drawn back to the library, each evening discovering new details that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Paintings appeared to hold different expressions in their subjects' faces, depending on the angle of the lamplight. Books rearranged themselves subtly, titles I could have sworn were on one shelf appearing on another. The grandfather clock became my constant companion, its measured ticks marking the passage of time as I explored the villa's mysteries. Sometimes in the depths of night, its chimes seemed to carry whispered words, fragments of conversations from long ago perhaps, or messages meant for ears that had long since passed from this world. One particularly rainy evening, I noticed something unusual about the clock's face. In the dim light, previously invisible markings appeared around its edges. delicate engravings that seemed to form a pattern. When I approached for a closer look, the silver key in my pocket grew unexpectedly warm. The villa itself seemed to breathe that night. The usual creaks and settling sounds took on a rhythm that reminded me of slow, deep breaths. The rain outside softened to a whisper, as though nature itself was listening for something. In the library, the shadows cast by my reading lamp danced differently, creating patterns that almost resembled written words on the walls. I found myself tracing the engravings on the clock's face with trembling fingers. The silver key pulsed with a gentle warmth that spread through my hand. As the minute hand approached midnight, the key's heat intensified, and the air in the room grew thick with anticipation. The first stroke of midnight brought with it a subtle shift in the quality of silence. By the fourth chime, the shadows had begun to move independently of their sources. The seventh stroke resonated at a frequency that made the windows vibrate ever so slightly. As the final note faded away, I noticed that my reflection in the clock's glass face wasn't quite synchronized with my movements. That's when I saw her, the woman from the photograph, reflected in the window behind me. She stood exactly as she had in the image, book in hand, pearl necklace gleaming. But when I turned around, the library remained empty save for myself. Turning back to the window, I found her reflection still there, watching me with eyes that held generations of secrets. The blue leather book in my hands grew warm, matching the temperature of the key. As I opened it again, the previously blank pages now held flowing script, the ink appearing as though freshly written. The words told stories of the villa, of the lives lived within its walls, of secrets passed down through generations of my family, secrets I had never known existed. Nights blended together as I immersed myself in these revelations. The villa's atmosphere grew more intimate, as though the house itself was gradually accepting my presence. The creaks and settling sounds began to feel like conversations. The moving shadows transformed into familiar patterns, like a language I was slowly learning to read. Sometimes, in the space between wakefulness and sleep, I would catch glimpses of other times overlapping with the present. A young couple dancing in the foyer, their laughter silent but their joy palpable. Children running through the halls, their forms transparent as morning mist. An elderly woman, my grandmother perhaps, sitting in my favorite armchair, smiling at something only she could see. The photographs in the album began to make more sense, though not in any way I could explicitly explain. Faces that had seemed unfamiliar now carried hints of recognition, as though I was remembering them from dreams rather than actual memories. The names written beneath them started to evoke emotions, like songs heard in childhood that resurface unexpectedly. The villa held more than just memories, I came to understand. It held moments, preserved like insects in amber, playing out eternally for those who knew how to perceive them. The grandfather clock wasn't just marking time, it was keeping track of when these moments might align, when the veil between then and now grew thin enough to glimpse through. Each midnight brought new revelations, each rainy evening added layers to the mystery. The woman in the window became a regular companion, though she never appeared except in reflections. Sometimes I would catch her smiling, as though pleased with my gradual understanding. Other times, she seemed to be waiting for something, her expression holding a patience that spanned decades. The silver key opened no physical locks, but it seemed to unlock something else, perception perhaps, or memory itself. Its warmth would guide me to new discoveries, a hidden panel in the library walls, a collection of letters tucked between the pages of various books, patterns in the wooden floor that mapped invisible paths through the villa. As weeks turned into months, I found myself becoming part of the villa's story. My own reflection began to linger slightly after I moved away from windows. The grandfather clock's chimes took on meanings I felt rather than heard. The shadows cast by my reading lamp joined the complex dance of those that had been there before me. I never found what I would call answers in the traditional sense. Instead, I found understanding, a deep, wordless knowledge that some places exist beyond the simple boundaries of time and space. The villa wasn't just a house, it was a collection of moments, all happening simultaneously, like pages in an infinite book that could be read in any order. The woman in the reflection, I came to believe, was both my grandmother and not my grandmother. She was every woman who had ever held that blue leather book at midnight, who had ever listened to the grandfather clock's chimes and understood their hidden meaning. Perhaps, in some reflection somewhere, I too had become part of that eternal moment. Even now, as I write these words in the blue leather book's blank pages, I know they will only appear to those who need to read them, when the clock strikes midnight and the shadows align just so. The villa keeps its own counsel, sharing its secrets only with those who have learned to listen to the silence between the raindrops, who understand that memory isn't just about the past, but about all moments existing together in an endless dance. The grandfather clock chimes midnight once again, and in the window's reflection I see someone standing behind my chair, holding a blue leather book. When I turn, there will be no one there. But somewhere, somewhen, another inheritor of the villa is turning to look for me, continuing the cycle that began long before any of us understood what we were becoming part of. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but to be experienced, to be lived within. The villa of faded memories taught me that. And somewhere, in a reflection that hasn't happened yet, I'm teaching it to someone else, one midnight at a time. Story 2. The rain fell softly through the evening air, each droplet catching the fading sunlight like tiny prisms suspended in time. I sat in my study, watching the ancient forest beyond my window transform into a painting of muted greens and grays. The gentle patter of rain against glass created a soothing rhythm that seemed to whisper ancient secrets, drawing me into a state of peaceful contemplation. My grandfather's weathered journal lay open before me, its pages filled with careful observations about the forest that had been our family's constant companion for generations. His meticulous notes spoke of unusual patterns in the fog that rolled through the trees each morning, of strange lights that danced between the branches on moonless nights, and of whispers that seemed to echo from the depths of the woods when no one was there to speak them. As a child, I had dismissed these writings as the fanciful musings of an old man who spent too much time alone. Now, having inherited both the house and its mysterious neighbor, I found myself drawn to his words with a new perspective. The forest had always possessed an otherworldly quality that defied explanation, but lately something felt different. The air itself seemed charged with an ancient energy that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. The rain intensified slightly, and I noticed how the droplets created intricate patterns on the window pane, like tears trailing down the glass. The soft yellow light from my desk lamp cast a warm glow that barely reached the corners of the room, leaving shadows to dance and play along the bookshelves. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the rich scent of wet earth and pine needles. As I turned another page in the journal, a pressed leaf fell onto my desk. It was unlike any I had ever seen in our forest, iridescent, with veins that seemed to pulse with a faint silvery light. I held it up to the lamp, watching as it transformed the light into subtle rainbow patterns that shifted and changed like oil on water. According to the accompanying note, my grandfather had found it on the night of a harvest moon, deep within the heart of the woods. The discovery sparked something in my memory, a half-forgotten conversation from weeks ago with Mrs. Bennett, the elderly woman who lived in the only other house bordering the forest. She had mentioned seeing similar leaves scattered around her garden, but they always seemed to vanish by morning, leaving only a fine, glittering dust behind. At the time, I had attributed her story to an active imagination, but now, holding this impossible leaf in my hands, I wasn't so sure. I spent the next few hours carefully documenting the leaf's properties in my own journal, following my grandfather's methodical approach. The rain continued its gentle symphony, occasionally interrupted by the soft creaking of the old house settling around me. As the evening deepened into night, the forest beyond my window seemed to grow more alive, its shadows deepening and shifting in ways that didn't quite match the movement of the wind through the trees. It was then that I noticed something peculiar. The leaf's glow had intensified, pulsing in rhythm with what appeared to be lights deep within the forest. They were barely visible through the rain and mist, soft, bluish-white orbs that floated between the trees like wayward stars. My grandfather had written about these lights, describing them as the forest's own constellation, bound to earth instead of sky. The logical part of my mind suggested bioluminescent fungi or some natural phenomenon, but there was something deliberate about their movement, as if they were trying to form patterns, or perhaps trying to communicate. I found myself leaning closer to the window, my breath fogging the glass as I watched the mysterious dance unfold. Without conscious thought, I found myself reaching for my coat and boots. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, and the air held that special quality unique to autumn evenings, crisp and clean, carrying the scent of decay and renewal. My grandfather's journal mentioned that the lights appeared most frequently on nights like this, when the barrier between our world and whatever lay beyond seemed thinnest. As I stepped onto the back porch, the wooden boards creaked softly beneath my feet. The sound of the forest at night enveloped me, the gentle rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night bird, and underneath it all, a subtle humming that seemed to resonate in my bones rather than my ears. The lights continued their slow dance among the trees, more visible now that I was outside. The path into the forest was one I knew well, marked by smooth stones that generations of my family had placed. Each step felt both familiar and strange, as if I was walking through memories and dreams simultaneously. The mist curled around my ankles like a living thing, and the air grew noticeably cooler as I passed beneath the canopy of ancient trees. The lights seemed to respond to my presence, their movement becoming more purposeful. They led me deeper into the forest, along paths I had never noticed before. The trees here were older, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes that suggested years of growing around something unseen. More of the iridescent leaves appeared, scattered across the forest floor like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Time began to lose meaning as I followed the lights. The forest around me transformed subtly. Colors became more vivid, shadows deeper, sounds more crystalline. Every sense was heightened, yet everything felt dreamlike. The humming in my bones grew stronger, and I realized it had taken on a pattern that reminded me of music heard from very far away. I came to a clearing I had never seen before, though I thought I knew every inch of these woods. Ancient stones stood in a perfect circle, their surfaces covered in patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The lights gathered here, their glow intensifying until they illuminated the entire space with a soft, pearl-like radiance. In the center of the circle stood a pool of water, so still it looked like black glass. As I approached, drawn by an inexplicable force, I saw that its surface reflected not the sky above, but what appeared to be another forest, similar to this one, yet fundamentally different. The trees in the reflection were silver-barked and crystal-leaved, their branches reaching toward an aurora-lit sky of impossible colors. The humming reached a crescendo, and the lights began to spiral around the clearing. Each iridescent leaf on the ground lifted into the air, spinning in a gentle dance that mirrored the movement of their counterparts in the reflected world below. I stood transfixed, understanding dawning like a slow sunrise. This was what my grandfather had been trying to document all along. The forest wasn't just a forest. It was a gateway, a meeting place between worlds. As if in response to this realization, the lights began to dim and the leaves slowly drifted back to earth. The humming faded to a whisper, then to silence. The reflection in the pool rippled once, then returned to showing only darkness. I felt no disappointment at this gentle conclusion, only a profound sense of peace and wonder. I made my way back home through the misty forest, collecting a few of the iridescent leaves as I went. By the time I reached my study, they had already begun to fade, their glow diminishing like stars at dawn. I carefully pressed them between the pages of my grandfather's journal, adding my own notes beneath his. As I sat in my chair, watching the first light of morning paint the sky in gentle pastels, I understood that I had only glimpsed the smallest fraction of what the forest held. Its secrets were not meant to be fully understood or explained, only experienced and appreciated. Like my grandfather before me, I would continue to observe and document, adding my own chapter to the ongoing story of the forest that keeps secrets. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean and new. In the growing light, the forest looked exactly as it always had, ancient, beautiful, and ordinary. But now I knew better. Now I understood why my grandfather had spent so many years watching and waiting, documenting the extraordinary in his careful hand. The forest had always been more than it appeared, and its greatest secret was that it would always have more secrets to share with those patient enough to listen. I closed the journal and smiled, knowing that tonight, or perhaps some night soon, the lights would appear again. The forest would continue its ancient dance between worlds, and I would be here to witness it, adding my own observations to the family legacy. After all, some secrets are meant to be kept, not solved, preserved like pressed leaves between the pages of time, waiting for the right moment to share their magic with those who are ready to see it. Story 3. The gentle patter of rain against weathered stone filled the evening air as I made my way along the winding coastal path. Waves crashed rhythmically against the shore below, their steady cadence a soothing backdrop to my solitary walk. The salty breeze carried whispers of the sea, mingling with the earthy scent of wet moss that clung to the ancient rock formations surrounding me. I had walked this path countless times before, studying the curious geological formations that dotted the shoreline. As a geologist, I found comfort in the predictability of stone, its layers telling stories of time immemorial, each stratum a chapter in Earth's endless tale. But tonight, something felt different. The familiar rocks seemed to hold shadows that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them, and the usual mineral glints took on an otherworldly sheen in the fading light. The black rocks that had always fascinated me, a rare formation of obsidian-like stone that had no geological business being there, appeared darker than usual, seeming to absorb what little light remained in the dusky air. Their smooth surfaces, normally reflective even in dim light, had taken on a peculiar matte quality. As I approached, I noticed that the rainfall appeared to avoid them entirely, creating a perfect dry circle around their base. My scientific mind immediately began cataloging possible explanations for this phenomenon, but each theory felt insufficient against the weight of what my senses were telling me. The air around the rocks had grown notably still, as if sound itself was being gently pulled inward. Even the constant symphony of waves seemed muted here, creating a pocket of near silence that felt both peaceful and slightly unnerving. Drawing closer, I noticed fine lines etched into the rock's surface, delicate patterns that I had somehow never seen before in all my years of studying this formation. They formed intricate geometric shapes that seemed to shift and flow when viewed from different angles, like oil on water. The patterns held an almost mathematical precision that defied natural explanation, yet they appeared weathered, as if they had been there for centuries. As I ran my fingers along the cool surface, I felt a subtle vibration, not unlike the deep, barely perceptible hum of distant machinery, but somehow more organic. The sensation traveled up my arm, bringing with it a profound sense of age and patience. It was as if the rock itself was breathing, moving on a timescale so vast that human perception could barely grasp it. The rain continued to fall in a gentle curtain around the formation, creating a natural boundary between the ordinary world and this small pocket of strangeness. Within this dry sphere, the air had taken on a quality I had never experienced before, heavy yet energized, like the atmosphere before a summer storm, but without any sense of threat or danger. As twilight deepened into true night, I noticed that the patterns in the rock had begun to emit a faint luminescence. The light was so subtle that at first I questioned whether I was actually seeing it, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, the glow became unmistakable. It pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm that matched perfectly with the sound of the waves I could now barely hear. The logical part of my mind suggested I should be frightened, or at least concerned, by these impossible observations. Yet I felt only a deep sense of peace and curiosity. The rocks seemed to be inviting closer inspection, calling to some primal part of my consciousness that recognized something ancient and benevolent in their presence. Taking out my notebook, I began to sketch the patterns, noting how they appeared to form a sort of doorway or portal when viewed from certain angles. As I drew, I realized that the designs weren't merely decorative. They appeared to be a form of writing or mathematical notation, but in a system I had never encountered in any of my geological studies. The hours passed without my noticing, the gentle rain creating a peaceful barrier between me and the outside world. My sketches filled page after page, each attempt to capture the patterns revealing new details I hadn't noticed before. The rock's subtle vibration had become a constant companion, its rhythm now so familiar that I only noticed it when I occasionally stepped away to gain a different perspective on the formation. As I worked, I began to understand that I was documenting something that existed somewhere between the realm of geology and another field of study for which we likely had no name. The black rocks weren't just a geological anomaly. They were a message, or perhaps a doorway, left by something or someone with a perspective of time and space very different from our own. Near midnight, the luminescence in the rock patterns grew slightly stronger, and the vibration took on a more complex rhythm. For a brief moment, I thought I could see through the surface of the stone, as if it had become temporarily transparent. Beyond it lay what appeared to be a vast space filled with similar formations, their patterns glowing with the same gentle light, stretching out into an impossible distance. The vision lasted only a few seconds before fading, leaving me with a profound sense of something larger than myself. Not threatening, but simply vast beyond human comprehension. The rocks had shown me something that my scientific training couldn't explain, yet my mind felt strangely at peace with this uncertainty. When I finally gathered my belongings to leave, I noticed that the rain had stopped, though I couldn't recall when. The black rocks had returned to their usual appearance, their patterns now barely visible in the moonlight. Yet I knew they were there, waiting to be discovered again by someone who took the time to really look. As I made my way home along the moonlit path, I wondered how many other people had noticed these patterns over the years. How many had felt the gentle vibration or seen the impossible space beyond the rock's surface? The formation had likely stood there for thousands of years, possibly longer, patient and unchanging, waiting for those who would understand what it was trying to show them. I still walk that path regularly, studying the black rocks and their mysterious patterns. Sometimes I see the ghostly luminescence, sometimes I don't. The portal, if that's truly what it is, seems to reveal itself according to its own rhythm and logic. I've filled numerous notebooks with observations and sketches, though I've never shared them with my colleagues. Some discoveries, I've come to believe, are meant to be experienced rather than explained. On quiet nights when the rain falls in that perfect circle around the rocks, I sit within their peaceful boundary and contemplate the nature of time and space. The gentle vibration has become a familiar friend, its rhythm a reminder that there are things in this world that exist beyond our current understanding. And somehow, that knowledge brings me more comfort than any scientific explanation ever could. The black rocks stand as they always have, their patterns still shifting in certain lights, their surface still humming with that ancient energy. They remain a mystery that bridges the gap between what we know and what we have yet to discover. And in that mystery, I have found a peculiar kind of home, a place where science and wonder coexist in perfect, peaceful balance. Story 4. The gentle sound of waves caressing ancient rocks filled the cool evening air as I made my way along the weathered coastal path. Each step crunched softly against the gravel beneath my feet, creating a rhythmic melody that blended with the whispers of the sea. The setting sun painted the clouds in muted shades of lavender and rose, their colors reflecting off the water's surface like watercolor bleeding across wet paper. I had always found solace in my evening walks along this secluded stretch of coastline, where the boundary between land and sea became increasingly uncertain with each passing tide. The limestone cliffs rose majestically on my right, their pale faces etched with countless years of stories written by wind and water. As darkness approached, the first stars began to peek through the twilight veil, their light barely visible against the deepening purple of the sky. The air carried a peculiar quality that evening, something different from the usual briny scent of seaweed and salt. It was subtle at first, like the ghost of a perfume that lingers in an empty room. As I walked further along the path, the scent grew stronger, a sweet old fragrance that reminded me of pressed flowers in ancient books and the musty corners of antique shops where time seemed to move more slowly. The tide was unusually low that night, revealing stretches of beach normally hidden beneath the waves. Scattered across the exposed sand were collections of smooth stones and shells, their surfaces gleaming with an opalescent sheen in the fading light. Among them, something caught my eye, a piece of sea glass, its edges softened by years of tumbling in the surf. As I bent to retrieve it, a sound drifted down from the cliffs above. It was so faint that at first I thought it was merely the wind playing through the eroded holes and crevices in the rock face. But as I stood still and listened more carefully, the sound resolved itself into something more distinct, a melody barely audible above the gentle lapping of waves. The notes seemed to float on the evening breeze, carrying with them an inexplicable sense of longing and remembrance. Moving closer to the cliff face, I noticed a narrow path I had never seen before, winding its way upward through the weathered stone. The route appeared precarious in the dimming light, but something about that haunting melody drew me forward. Each step I took up the path revealed new details in the rock face, curious patterns that almost resembled writing, though in no alphabet I recognized. The sea glass in my pocket seemed to grow warmer as I climbed, its presence becoming more noticeable with each step. The melody grew stronger too, though it remained elusive. Whenever I thought I could finally make out the tune clearly, it would shift and change, like trying to remember a dream upon waking. The sweet, old perfume scent intensified, mixing with the salt air in an intoxicating combination that made my head feel slightly light. As I rounded a bend in the path, I came upon a sight that made me pause in wonder. Set into the cliff face was what appeared to be an ancient doorway, its surface carved with intricate spirals and curves that seemed to move in the corner of my vision. The stone around it was different from the rest of the cliff, darker, with veins of some mineral that caught the last rays of sunlight and reflected them in mesmerizing patterns. The melody seemed to emanate from behind this door, along with soft whispers that might have been voices or might have been the wind. It was impossible to tell which. The sea glass in my pocket had grown quite warm now, and when I removed it, I saw that it was glowing with a gentle, pulsing light that matched the rhythm of the distant song. Drawing closer to the door, I noticed that among the carved spirals was a small depression that appeared exactly the right size and shape to hold the piece of sea glass I had found. My heart beat a little faster as I considered the implications. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible, that doors don't simply appear in cliffs, that sea glass doesn't glow, that coincidences this perfect don't exist in the real world. But another part of me, the part that still believed in midnight magic and childhood dreams, urged me forward. The whispers grew more distinct as I approached, though I still couldn't make out any words. They carried emotions rather than meaning, longing, joy, sorrow, and something else I couldn't quite name. The glowing sea glass pulsed more brightly, casting shadows that danced across the carved surface of the door. With trembling fingers, I reached out and placed the sea glass into the depression. It fit perfectly, as I had known it would. For a moment, nothing happened except for a slight change in the tone of the whispers. Then, very slowly, the carved spirals began to move, flowing like water across the surface of the door. The whispers grew louder, and now I could almost understand what they were saying. Almost, but not quite. The door didn't so much open as dissolve, the stone becoming transparent, like morning mist burning away in sunlight. Beyond it lay a chamber carved into the heart of the cliff, its walls covered in the same flowing patterns as the door. But what caught my attention were the figures that seemed to move within the patterns themselves, shadowy forms that might have been people, or memories of people, their movements as fluid as smoke in still air. The melody was clear now, a song of such profound beauty and sadness that tears began to form in my eyes without my realizing it. The figures in the walls danced to its rhythm, acting out stories I somehow knew were ancient beyond reckoning. I stood transfixed, watching as tales of love and loss, triumph and tragedy, played out before me in that strange, shifting dance. Time lost all meaning in that place. The whispers had become a chorus, and though I still couldn't understand the words, I felt their meaning in my heart. They spoke of memories preserved in stone and salt, of voices that refused to be silenced by the passing of years, of stories that needed to be remembered even when their original tellers had long since returned to dust. I don't know how long I stood there, watching the shadow stories dance across the walls. It might have been minutes or hours or days. But eventually, I became aware of a change in the quality of light behind me. Turning, I saw through the misty doorway that the sky had begun to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The whispers grew softer, and the shadows in the walls began to still their dance. The melody that had led me here faded until it was once again barely audible above the sound of the waves below. The sea glass that had served as my key grew dark and cool, falling from its setting into my waiting hand. As I made my way back down the cliff path, I found myself humming a tune I didn't recognize. Or perhaps I did, from a dream or a memory or some place between the two. The door had vanished as if it had never been there, leaving only smooth limestone behind. But the patterns I had seen continued to dance behind my closed eyelids, and the whispers echoed in the chambers of my mind. I still walk that path every evening, carrying the sea glass in my pocket. Sometimes when the tide is low and the light is just right, I catch glimpses of those flowing patterns in the cliff face. Sometimes, floating on the edge of sleep, I hear fragments of that beautiful, sorrowful melody. And sometimes, very rarely, when the moon is full and the air carries that sweet old perfume, I find the door again. But what lies beyond it is never quite the same twice. And the stories the shadows tell are always different, though no less ancient and true. I've come to understand that the cliff holds not just one tale, but many. A library of forgotten voices preserved in stone and salt, waiting for those who would remember them. The sea glass stays cool now most nights, but occasionally, as I walk along the shore, it grows warm in my pocket, and I know that somewhere above me, in the heart of the cliff, another story is waiting to be witnessed, another voice longing to be heard. And so I climb the path again, guided by that distant melody, ready to serve as witness to the memories that the waves and wind have kept safe for so long. In the end, I've learned that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but rather experienced and carried forward. The Cliff of Forgotten Voices has its own rhythm, its own purpose, and those of us who find our way to its hidden door are merely temporary custodians of the tales it chooses to share. Perhaps that's enough, to listen, to remember, and to know that somewhere, carved into ancient stone and sung by voices that refuse to fade entirely into silence, the stories go on. Story 5. The gentle patter of autumn rain created a soothing rhythm against the wooden shingles of my grandmother's old house. I had inherited this Victorian mansion just 2 months ago, and every evening since then had brought with it new discoveries, each more intriguing than the last. Tonight was no different. As I sat in the library, surrounded by leather-bound books whose spines emanated the comforting scent of aged paper and forgotten memories, the warm glow of my reading lamp cast long shadows across the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, while the rain outside painted shifting patterns on the mahogany walls. A cup of chamomile tea sat steaming beside me, its delicate floral aroma mingling with the musty sweetness of old books. The grandfather clock in the corner marked time with its deep, resonant ticks, each sound echoing through the quiet house like a gentle heartbeat. As I turned another page of my grandmother's journal, a soft whisper of wind drew my attention to the window. The evening fog had rolled in early tonight, unusually thick and pearlescent in the warm light from the house. It swirled and danced against the glass panes, creating shapes that seemed almost deliberate in their movement. I found myself setting aside the journal, drawn to the hypnotic patterns forming in the mist. Rising from my comfortable armchair, I approached the window, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The fog had transformed the familiar garden into a dreamlike landscape, where familiar shapes became mysterious silhouettes. The old oak tree, usually so distinct against the sky, now appeared as a mere suggestion of itself, its branches reaching into the white void like gentle fingers. That's when I noticed something peculiar. Through the swirling mist, I could make out what appeared to be a staircase, ascending from the garden into the fog. It wasn't the weathered wooden steps that led down to the rose garden. These stairs were made of smooth, pale stone, spiraling upward with an elegant grace that seemed to defy architectural possibility. I blinked slowly, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me. The chamomile tea, the late hour, the hypnotic dance of fog, surely these had combined to create this illusion. Yet when I opened my eyes again, the staircase remained, more distinct than before. Its marble-like surface seemed to glow with a soft, pearl-white luminescence that matched the surrounding mist. Drawn by an inexplicable curiosity, I found myself moving through the house, my bare feet silent against the wooden floors. The air grew cooler as I approached the garden door, and the scent of wet earth and night-blooming jasmine wafted through the crack beneath it. My hand hesitated on the brass doorknob, its cold surface grounding me in reality, even as the world beyond seemed to slip further into dream. Opening the door released a gentle sigh of misty air into the house. The fog curled around my ankles like a content cat, cool but not unpleasant. The stone steps began mere feet from where I stood, their surface unmarked by rain despite the steady drizzle that continued to fall. As I approached, I noticed delicate patterns carved into the risers, intricate swirls and curves that seemed to move when viewed from different angles. The first step felt solid beneath my foot, despite its ethereal appearance. The stone was smooth and neither warm nor cold, as though it existed at the perfect temperature. Each subsequent step brought me higher into the mist, which now surrounded me completely. The house below began to fade from view, though the warm glow of its windows remained visible, like distant stars in a white sky. As I ascended, the sound of rain gradually transformed into something more musical, as though each droplet were striking crystal instead of earth. The air took on a sweet, unfamiliar scent, something between fresh snow and summer flowers, an impossible combination that somehow felt right in this impossible place. The higher I climbed, the more the stairs seemed to change. The carved patterns began to shift and flow like liquid silver, and each step appeared to materialize just as I needed it, while those behind me dissolved back into the mist. Yet I felt no fear. There was something deeply peaceful about this strange journey, as though I were walking through a dream I'd had 1,000 times before. At what felt like the 100th step, I began to hear music. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the crystalline rain sounds, but it grew clearer with each step. The melody was hauntingly familiar, reminiscent of a lullaby my grandmother used to hum while tending her roses. The notes seemed to weave through the fog, creating patterns that matched the flowing designs on the stairs. Then I saw them, subtle at first, but becoming clearer as I watched. Shadows moved within the mist, not dark or threatening, but gentle silhouettes that danced to the ethereal music. They reminded me of old photographs come to life, showing glimpses of parties and gatherings that might have taken place in the house over its many years. Ladies in flowing dresses, gentlemen in tailcoats, children running and playing, all transformed into graceful shapes of light and shadow. The scent of roses began to permeate the air, growing stronger with each step. Not the cultivated roses from grandmother's garden, but something wilder, more primal, the essence of every rose that had ever bloomed since the beginning of time. Mixed with it came other scents, old books, sea salt, fresh bread, summer rain, each trigger of memory appearing and fading, like the steps beneath my feet. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I continued to climb. The warm lights of the house far below now looked like fireflies in the mist, and the music had become a symphony of memories, each note carrying with it fragments of forgotten moments. I saw my grandmother's hands turning the pages of her journal, heard her voice reading stories on rainy afternoons, felt the warmth of summer days spent in her garden. At last, I reached a landing where the stairs ceased their upward spiral. Here, the fog was thinner, and I could see what appeared to be a door standing freely in space. It was made of the same luminescent stone as the stairs, but covered in the same flowing patterns, which moved more quickly now, like quicksilver in the moonlight. As I stood before this impossible door, I realized I could hear voices carried on the wind, distant conversations, laughter, and songs from years past. They weren't distinct enough to make out words, but they carried emotions so clear and pure they brought tears to my eyes. Joy, love, longing, hope, all mixing together like colors in a painting. I reached out toward the door, my fingers just inches from its shifting surface. The pattern seemed to reach back toward me, like ripples in a pond moving in reverse. But before I could touch it, a familiar scent caught my attention. My grandmother's perfume, mixed with the smell of fresh ink and paper. The memory hit me with sudden clarity, her journal, still sitting open on the table beside my chair in the library. There was something important in those pages, something I needed to read. The realization was like a gentle tug, drawing my attention back to the world below. I turned to look back down the spiral staircase, but there was nothing there, only swirling fog that glowed with its own inner light. Yet I didn't feel lost or afraid. Somehow I knew that if I simply thought of the library, of the warm lamp and waiting tea, I would find my way back. As this thought formed, the fog began to thin. Gradually, I became aware of the familiar texture of the Persian rug beneath my feet. The luminescent mist faded like a gentle exhalation, leaving me standing by the garden door in my grandmother's house. The door was closed, though I couldn't remember closing it, and through its window panes I could see only ordinary darkness and ordinary fog. Returning to the library, I found my tea still steaming, as though no time had passed at all. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, counting seconds that suddenly felt more fluid than before. I picked up my grandmother's journal, finding my place among her elegant handwriting. As I read, I noticed a passage I hadn't seen before, written in a different ink than the surrounding pages. The stairs appear only to those who need them, when the fog is thick and time grows thin. They lead to different places for different people, but always to somewhere we need to go, even if we don't reach the destination. Sometimes the journey itself is the answer we seek. I closed the journal gently and looked out the window again. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the familiar shapes of the garden. But now I knew that on certain nights, when the mist rolls in thick and pearl white, there might be a staircase waiting, its shifted patterns still moving in the corner of my eye, leading up into memories and mysteries that exist somewhere between reality and dreams. The rain continued its gentle pattern on the roof, and the grandfather clock kept its steady rhythm, but both sounds now seemed to carry an echo of that distant, ethereal music. I settled back into my chair, wrapped in the comfort of knowing that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only experienced and remembered, like the fading notes of a half-remembered lullaby, or the lingering scent of roses in an autumn rain. Story 6. The gentle whisper of wind through ancient pine needles carried the scent of approaching rain, a familiar comfort on this autumn evening. I stood at the base of a winding forest path, my flashlight beam barely penetrating the thick mist that had settled among the trees. Above, clouds drifted lazily across the face of a full moon, creating an ethereal dance of light and shadow on the damp earth below. The wooden cabin ahead had been my sanctuary for years, a peaceful retreat where I could escape the noise of everyday life and lose myself in the quiet solitude of nature. Tonight, however, something felt different. The air held an unusual stillness, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. As I approached the cabin's weathered porch, the old boards creaked beneath my feet with familiar voices, each plank singing its own distinct note. The sound echoed softly in the misty air, accompanied by the gentle patter of the first raindrops falling on the roof's metal surface. My key turned smoothly in the lock, and I stepped inside, welcomed by the subtle scent of cedar and old books. I moved through my evening routine with practiced ease, setting down my bag, hanging my coat on its hook, and reaching for the iron poker to stir the banked embers in the fireplace. But as I turned toward the hearth, I noticed something unusual. The ashes were arranged in a pattern I didn't recall making, forming what looked like concentric circles. Perhaps it was just a trick of the shadows, I thought, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slightly out of place. The rain grew steadier outside as I settled into my favorite armchair with a worn leather journal. Lightning flickered in the distance, its gentle pulses filtering through the cabin's windows and casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. I had always found comfort in watching storms roll across the landscape, but tonight the shadows seemed to move with an odd deliberateness, as if they were trying to tell me something. I began to notice other small discrepancies throughout the evening. The arrangement of my books on the shelf appeared slightly different, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly how. A ceramic mug I was certain I'd left in the kitchen cabinet sat on the windowsill, collecting moonlight like a silent sentinel. The old grandfather clock in the corner, which had stopped working months ago, ticked softly, so quietly I might have imagined it. As midnight approached, the storm outside intensified. Raindrops drummed against the windows in complex rhythms that almost seemed to form words just beyond my understanding. The wind's whistle through the eaves took on an almost musical quality, rising and falling in patterns that felt deliberately composed. I found myself drawn to the cabin's small study, where moonlight spilled through the window onto my desk. The silver light illuminated an old photograph I kept there, a picture of the cabin taken the day I first discovered it. But something about the image caught my eye. In the window of the photographed cabin, I could make out a faint silhouette that I'd never noticed before. It appeared to be watching the photographer, watching me. The longer I stared at the photograph, the more details emerged from its aged surface. The figure in the window seemed to shift slightly each time I blinked, as if adjusting its position to maintain its view. Behind it, I could make out what looked like shelves lined with books, but my study had never contained bookshelves in that spot. A sudden gust of wind sent the study's curtains billowing inward, though I was certain the window had been closed. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and I felt a curious sensation, not of fear, but of anticipation, as if I were on the verge of understanding something important. I turned slowly to face the window, half expecting to see my own reflection. Instead, I found myself looking into what appeared to be another room entirely, visible through the glass as if it were a portal. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes I didn't recognize. A comfortable-looking chair sat before a crackling fireplace, and beside it stood a figure, indistinct in the shadows but undeniably present. The figure raised its hand in what seemed like a greeting, and I felt an inexplicable sense of recognition. The gesture was familiar, though I couldn't explain why. Without thinking, I raised my own hand in response. The air between us seemed to shimmer, and for a moment I could hear the crackle of the fire from that other room, smell the distinct aroma of old paper and leather bindings. The grandfather clock's chimes echoed through the cabin, though I knew it hadn't worked in months. With each resonant tone, the vision in the window grew fainter, like morning mist dissipating in sunlight. By the final stroke, I was looking at my own reflection once more, but the room behind me in the glass wasn't quite the same as the one I stood in. I spent the remainder of the night in my armchair, watching the storm gradually subside. The shadows continued their strange dance on the walls, but now they seemed less mysterious and more like old friends sharing a secret. The rain's rhythm became a lullaby, and the wind's whistle through the eaves carried hints of half-remembered melodies. As dawn approached, I found myself writing in my journal, trying to capture the events of the night, but the words felt inadequate to describe what I'd experienced. Was it a dream? A glimpse into another world? Or perhaps something else entirely? A moment when the boundaries between what we know and what we imagine become less distinct. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light across the cabin's wooden floors. Everything appeared normal. The study window showed only the forest outside. The grandfather clock stood silent, and the photograph on my desk displayed nothing more than the cabin as I'd always known it. Yet something had changed. The cabin felt different now, as if it had revealed a small part of itself to me. I realized that perhaps it had always been more than just a refuge from the world. It was a threshold to something else, something that existed in the spaces between moments, in the shadows between heartbeats. I still returned to the cabin regularly, And on nights when the moon is veiled by clouds and the rain taps gently at the windows, I sometimes catch glimpses of that other room. The figure is often there, reading by firelight or writing in a journal that looks remarkably like my own. We never speak, but we share an understanding that transcends words, an acknowledgement that reality holds more mystery than we imagine, and that sometimes the most profound truths come to us in the quietest moments. The boundaries between what is real and what is imagined remain fluid in my forest refuge. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be, a gentle reminder that the world is full of quiet magic, if only we have the patience to notice it, and the wisdom to accept that some mysteries are better left partially unsolved. In the end, I've come to understand that my cabin is neither entirely here nor entirely elsewhere. It exists in that liminal space where certainty gives way to possibility, where the familiar transforms into the extraordinary. And on nights when the moon hangs full and veiled in the sky, I sit in my armchair and wait, knowing that sometimes the most comforting mysteries are the ones that stay just beyond our grasp, like shadows dancing on the wall or whispers carried on the wind. Story 7. The old grandfather clock in the hallway marked each passing moment with its gentle heartbeat, a steady rhythm that had accompanied my evenings for as long as I could remember. Rain tapped softly against the window panes, creating an ethereal melody that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. The warm glow of my reading lamp cast a pool of amber light across the leather-bound journal in my lap, its pages filled with my grandmother's elegant handwriting. I had discovered the journal earlier that day while sorting through a dusty trunk in the attic, buried beneath layers of old quilts and faded photographs. The musty scent of aged paper mingled with the aroma of the chamomile tea steaming beside me, creating an atmosphere of contemplative nostalgia. The journal entries began ordinarily enough, daily observations about the weather, garden notes, and recipes. But as I turned each delicate page, something shifted in the writing. My grandmother's normally precise penmanship began to waver, and her entries grew shorter, more fragmented. She wrote of hearing footsteps in the night, soft and rhythmic, like someone dancing to music only they could hear. The warm lamplight flickered momentarily, drawing my attention to the rain-streaked window. Beyond the glass, the garden lay shrouded in mist, the old stone path barely visible in the gathering darkness. A feeling of gentle unease settled over me. Not fear exactly, but awareness, as if the house itself had drawn a deep breath and was holding it. My grandmother's words spoke of similar nights, when the rain would fall in gentle curtains and the air would grow thick with anticipation. The footsteps always begin at midnight, she wrote, moving from the garden path to the back door, then through the kitchen, down the hall, and up the stairs. They pause at each bedroom door, lingering longest at mine, before continuing their midnight waltz. The clock struck 11, its chimes resonating through the quiet house. I shifted in my armchair, drawing my soft wool blanket closer. The tea had grown cold, but I couldn't bring myself to move to the kitchen for a fresh cup. Instead, I turned another page, my fingers tracing the slight indentations where my grandmother's pen had pressed into the paper. "I've begun to notice other changes," the entry continued. "Small things at first. A book moved from one shelf to another, the piano bench slightly askew, the scent of lavender where there had been none before. Then larger things. Music box melodies playing in empty rooms, footprints appearing in the morning dew, though they fade before anyone else can see them. The rain intensified, drumming a gentle crescendo against the roof. In the garden, shadows seemed to sway and dance among the roses my grandmother had planted decades ago. I remembered how she used to tell me that roses remember the hands that tend them, that they bloom more vibrantly for those they recognize. Another page turned, revealing an entry dated just weeks before my grandmother's peaceful passing in her sleep. "I understand now," she wrote, her handwriting suddenly clear and steady. "The footsteps aren't searching, they're returning. Every night they trace the paths of memories, touching each place where joy once lived. They're not haunting the house, they're dancing with it, remembering." The clock struck 1:45, and a floorboard creaked softly in the kitchen. I held my breath, listening. The sound could have been the house settling, as old houses often do on rainy nights. But then another board sighed, and another, forming a pattern that moved with deliberate grace. I thought about closing the journal, about retreating upstairs to my bedroom. Instead, I remained in my chair, watching as tendrils of mist pressed against the window pane like curious fingers. The footsteps drew closer, each one as soft as a falling leaf. They carried with them the faintest hint of lavender, my grandmother's favorite perfume. The clock began to strike midnight, and with each chime, the footsteps matched their rhythm. They moved past my chair with the gentleness of a summer breeze, stirring the pages of the open journal. I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shimmer of movement like sunlight on water, but when I turned my head, there was only the play of shadows on the wall. The footsteps continued their journey through the house, and I found myself swaying slightly in my chair, as if my body recognized a melody I couldn't quite hear. The rain provided a soft accompaniment, and somewhere in the distance, wind chimes added their silver voices to the night's symphony. When the footsteps reached the stairs, I rose from my chair, drawn by a curiosity that felt as natural as breathing. I followed their sound, maintaining a respectful distance, as they moved from door to door. At each threshold, they paused, and in those moments of silence, I could almost see the memories they were revisiting. Children's laughter, bedtime stories, quiet conversations that had shaped generations. As midnight's last echo faded, the footsteps grew fainter, but they didn't disappear entirely. Instead, they seemed to merge with the house itself, becoming part of its heartbeat, its breathing, its dreams. I returned to my chair, picking up the journal once more. The last entry remained unfinished, trailing off mid-sentence, but now I understood why. My grandmother hadn't needed to explain further. The house still danced with her memories, still held the warmth of her presence in its walls. The footsteps weren't a haunting, they were a continuation, a gentle reminder that some bonds transcend the ordinary boundaries of time and space. I closed the journal softly and placed it on the side table. The rain had gentled to a whisper, and the mist in the garden had begun to take on shapes that seemed almost familiar. I didn't feel afraid or unsettled. Instead, a profound sense of peace settled over me, as if I had finally understood a truth that had always been present, waiting patiently to be discovered. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I could have sworn I heard the distant notes of a music box playing my grandmother's favorite waltz. The sound blended perfectly with the rain, the ticking clock, and the soft footsteps that continued their eternal dance through the halls of memory. In the morning, I found a single rose petal on my windowsill, still damp with dew, carrying the faintest trace of lavender. I smiled, understanding that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be embraced, like a familiar dance partner, leading us through steps we didn't know we remembered. The journal now sits on my bedside table, its pages holding not just my grandmother's words, but the rhythm of those midnight footsteps, the smell of rain and roses, the whispered secrets of a house that remembers. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the rain falls soft and steady, I find myself swaying gently to a melody I can almost hear, dancing with memories that have become as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. The footsteps continue their nightly journey, and I've learned to listen for them, to appreciate their gentle reminder that love leaves echoes that never truly fade. They've become my lullaby, a song of connection that spans generations, telling stories of lives lived, joy shared, and bonds that grow stronger with each passing season. And so the dance goes on, in the space between raindrops, in the whisper of wind through roses, in the soft creak of floorboards that know exactly where to give way to ghostly feet. The mystery remains, but it's a comfortable one, like a well-worn blanket or a familiar embrace. After all, isn't that what homes are meant to be? Not just places where we live, but spaces where memories dance eternally, keeping time with the gentle rhythm of love that refuses to be forgotten. Story 8. The gentle patter of rain against leaves created a soothing rhythm as I made my way through the dense forest. Twilight was settling in, casting long shadows between the ancient trees whose branches swayed softly in the evening breeze. The air carried the rich scent of damp earth and pine needles, a familiar comfort that wrapped around me like a well-worn blanket. I had walked this path countless times before, documenting the local flora for my research. The forest had become a second home, its quiet passages and hidden corners as familiar to me as the rooms of my house. But tonight something felt different. The rain-soaked air seemed to hold a peculiar weight, carrying whispers I couldn't quite understand. My attention was drawn to a subtle change in the forest floor. Where moss-covered stones typically formed a natural barrier, there now appeared to be a narrow opening. The recent heavy rains must have shifted the earth, revealing what looked like the entrance to a small cave. A faint phosphorescence emanated from within, casting a barely perceptible glow that made the wet stones glisten. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached slowly, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The cave opening was just large enough for a person to enter comfortably, and the air flowing from it carried an unusual warmth, despite the cool evening. My research equipment included a reliable flashlight, which I switched on before carefully making my way inside. The passage descended gently, its walls smooth and oddly uniform, as if they had been worn down by centuries of flowing water. The beam of my flashlight revealed delicate mineral formations that seemed to pulse with a subtle inner light. These crystalline structures appeared to respond to my presence, their gentle luminescence shifting ever so slightly as I passed. As I ventured deeper, the sound of the rain grew distant, replaced by a different kind of music, the soft drip of water from unseen heights and a low, almost melodic humming that seemed to emanate from the very rocks themselves. The air grew warmer, carrying a sweet, mineral scent that reminded me of summer thunderstorms. The passage opened into a chamber that took my breath away. The ceiling rose high above, disappearing into darkness, but what captured my attention were the thousands of tiny lights scattered across the walls. They resembled stars, twinkling with a soft blue-green radiance. My flashlight beam caught them, making them shimmer like dewdrops in morning sun. I switched off my flashlight to better observe the natural phenomenon. The bioluminescence, for that must have been what it was, provided enough light to see by, casting everything in a gentle, aqueous glow. The chamber felt alive, breathing with an ancient rhythm I could almost touch. Moving further into the space, I noticed something peculiar. The light seemed to respond to my movements, dimming slightly as I approached and brightening in my wake. It was as if they were aware of my presence, playing a game of light and shadow that defied scientific explanation. Near the center of the chamber stood a pool of water, so still it mirrored the lights above with perfect clarity. The surface was untouched by ripples, creating an illusion of infinite depth. As I knelt beside it, my reflection showed something strange. The lights behind me appeared to move independently of their counterparts on the walls, creating patterns that didn't match reality. I reached out to touch the water, but stopped just short. The air above the pool felt different, charged with a gentle energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. The lights in the chamber dimmed ever so slightly, focusing their glow on the pool's surface. In its depths, I could have sworn I saw shapes moving, not threatening but beckoning, like friends waiting at the bottom of a garden path. A soft sound echoed through the chamber, perhaps a drop of water, perhaps something else, and the lights began to change. They moved across the walls in slow waves, creating patterns that seemed almost like writing. The symbols, if that's what they were, felt familiar somehow, as if I should be able to read them, but they shifted and changed before I could grasp their meaning. Time became fluid in that space. I couldn't tell if I had been there for minutes or hours. The chamber's gentle light and the rhythmic movement of the bioluminescent displays created a meditative state that made the outside world feel distant and unimportant. I found myself settling onto a smooth stone near the pool, watching the play of light and shadow. The humming from the rocks grew softer, more musical, almost like a lullaby sung in a language too old for human ears to properly comprehend. The lights continued their dance, each pattern telling what seemed to be part of an endless story. A cool breeze touched my face, carrying with it a hint of rain-scented air from the surface. It was a gentle reminder of the world above, but it also brought something else. A whispered sound that might have been words, might have been simply the wind finding its way through ancient passages. The lights dimmed further, creating a cocoon of soft illumination around the pool. In its perfect mirror surface, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Not my own reflection, but what appeared to be another chamber, inverted and deeper, where other lights moved in patterns that weren't quite the same as those above. I leaned closer, drawn by an inexplicable sense of recognition. The lights in the reflections seemed to reach up toward me, while those on the chamber walls drew back, creating a tunnel of gentle illumination that centered on the pool. The humming in the rocks grew just slightly louder, more insistent, as if trying to communicate something of vital importance. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, each drop creating a note in what was becoming a complex melody. The lights pulsed in time with this natural music, and I found myself swaying slightly, caught up in a rhythm that felt as old as the earth itself. As I watched, the patterns in the pool began to form what looked like doorways, not physical entrances, but suggestions of passages that seemed to lead to other places, other times. Through one, I caught a glimpse of what might have been an ancient forest, its trees glowing with the same bioluminescent light that filled the cave. Through another, stars wheeled in patterns I had never seen in any sky. The air grew thick with possibility. Each breath carried the taste of mineral-laden water and something else, something that reminded me of the moment just before dawn, when the world holds its breath in anticipation of the sun. The lights continued their dance, each movement suggesting stories and secrets just beyond my understanding. I don't know how long I sat there, watching the play of light and shadow, listening to the cave's ancient music. Eventually, I became aware of a change in the air, a freshening, a slight cooling that suggested evening had become deep night above ground. The lights seemed to sense it too, their patterns growing slower, more subdued. Reluctantly, I rose from my stone seat. The lights in the pool swirled one last time, showing me something that might have been a farewell, might have been an invitation to return. As I made my way back toward the entrance, the bioluminescent displays followed me, lighting my path with a gentle radiance that kept the darkness at bay. The passage seemed shorter on my return journey, though I couldn't be sure if that was reality or simply my perception. The sound of rain grew stronger as I approached the surface, its steady rhythm weaving into the cave's fading song. Emerging into the night air, I turned to look back at the cave entrance. The faint phosphorescence I had first noticed was still there, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. As I watched, the opening seemed to shift slightly, stones settling back into new positions that made it less obvious to passing eyes. In the days that followed, I returned to that spot many times, Sometimes I found the entrance exactly as I remembered it, and spent hours watching the lights tell their endless stories. Other times, the cave seemed to have vanished entirely, leaving only moss-covered stones and the whisper of wind through trees. But on quiet nights, when the rain falls softly and the air holds that special weight of possibility, I can still hear the cave's distant song. The lights dance behind my closed eyes, telling stories of other worlds, other times, other possibilities that wait just beyond the threshold of ordinary reality. And sometimes in that space between waking and dreaming, I wonder if the cave found me, rather than the other way around. If its ancient lights chose to share their stories with me for reasons I may never fully understand. The forest keeps its secrets well, and the cave of darkened lights remains one of its deepest mysteries. Yet somehow, I feel that's exactly as it should be. Some wonders aren't meant to be understood, only experienced and remembered, like the lingering notes of a half-remembered lullaby carried on the evening breeze. Story 9. The gentle whisper of falling rain created a soothing melody against the weathered window panes of my grandmother's old Victorian house. From my writing desk in the library, I watched as silvery droplets traced meandering paths down the glass, casting subtle shadows on the worn leather volumes that lined the mahogany shelves. The soft glow of my desk lamp created a warm cocoon around me as I worked on cataloging her extensive collection of botanical journals and pressed flower specimens. I had inherited the house just 2 weeks ago, along with its labyrinth of rooms filled with curiosities collected over my grandmother's long and fascinating life. As a botanist who specialized in rare flowering plants, she had traveled extensively, though she always returned to tend her own private garden. That garden now lay somewhere beyond the wall of thorny vines that had overtaken the back of the property, a twisted barrier that seemed to have sprung up overnight after her passing. The steady patter of rain was interrupted by a curious sound, a delicate tinkling, like wind chimes made of glass, carried on the evening breeze. I lifted my head from my work, letting the sound wash over me. It seemed to be coming from somewhere beyond the library's bay window, past the thorny wall that I could just make out in the growing dusk. The sound held an almost musical quality, reminiscent of the crystalline notes my grandmother used to create by running her finger around the rim of her favorite crystal glasses. Setting aside the journal I had been examining, I moved closer to the window. The rain had lightened to a gentle mist that softened the edges of everything it touched. As I peered through the gathering darkness, I noticed something unusual, a soft bluish glow emanating from somewhere behind the wall of thorns. It pulsed gently, like the beating of a heart, sending waves of ethereal light washing over the twisted vines. The sight stirred a memory. My grandmother's voice, soft and melodious, telling me stories of bioluminescent flowers that bloomed only under specific conditions, during the new moon or after 3 days of gentle rain. I had always assumed these were just fairy tales meant to delight a child's imagination. But now, watching that mysterious light dance through the thorns, I wasn't so certain. I found myself drawn to my grandmother's study, where her most precious botanical journals were kept. The room held the lingering scent of dried herbs and old paper, a comforting smell that brought back countless memories of watching her press flowers between sheets of parchment. The leather chair behind her desk still held the impression of her small frame, and as I settled into it, I could almost imagine her presence beside me. Among the carefully organized volumes, I found what I was seeking, a journal bound in midnight blue leather, its pages filled with her precise handwriting and delicate sketches. The entry that caught my eye described a rare species of night-blooming flower that produced a soft blue luminescence and was said to ring like tiny bells when its petals opened. The margin notes mentioned something about a specific sequence of weather conditions, 3 days of gentle rain followed by a new moon. With a start, I realized that tonight was indeed the new moon, and we had just experienced our third consecutive day of rain. The coincidence sent a gentle shiver down my spine. According to my grandmother's notes, these flowers were incredibly rare, thought to exist only in a handful of carefully tended garden sanctuaries around the world. Yet here was that distinctive blue glow, right beyond my own wall of thorns. As I read further, I discovered more curious details. The flowers were said to bloom in gardens that existed in what my grandmother called the spaces between, places where the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary grew thin. Her notes spoke of gardens that appeared only under certain conditions, tended by gardeners who walked the line between our world and another. The sound of the glass-like chimes grew stronger, carrying with it the faintest hint of an unfamiliar perfume, sweet and ethereal, like honey made from starlight. Rising from the desk, I gathered my grandmother's journal and a small brass key I found tucked between its pages. The key was old, its surface etched with a pattern of intertwining vines that seemed to shift in the lamplight. Making my way through the quiet house, I reached the back door that led to what had once been my grandmother's garden. The thorny wall loomed before me, but now I could see something I hadn't noticed before. A narrow archway, barely visible in the blue-tinged darkness. The vines seemed less dense there, as if they had been carefully trained to form a passage. The key felt warm in my hand as I approached the arch. There, half hidden among the thorns, I found a small keyhole set into what appeared to be an ancient wooden door. The brass key slipped in perfectly, turning with a sound like distant wind chimes. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a path that wound its way through the thorny barrier. As I stepped through the doorway, the air changed. It became warmer, heavy with the scent of night-blooming flowers and rich earth. The path beneath my feet was soft with moss, and the thorny vines that had seemed so impenetrable from the outside now arched overhead like ribbing of a cathedral, their sharp edges softened by clusters of tiny white flowers that glowed with a pearl-like luminescence. The path led me deeper into what should have been a small suburban garden, but instead opened into an impossibly vast space. Here, the blue light I had seen from the library window revealed its source. Hundreds of flowers, unlike any I had ever seen, their petals transparent as glass and glowing with an inner light. They rang softly as they opened to the night air, their music creating a symphony that seemed to resonate with something deep within my soul. Among the luminescent blooms, I began to notice other wonders. Butterflies with wings like stained glass that caught and reflected the flower's light. Delicate spiral patterns in the grass that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. And most curiously, tools and gardening implements that appeared to be floating gently just above the ground, as if recently set down by an invisible gardener. I found my grandmother's favorite bench nestled beneath an arbor of flowering vines. As I sat down, I opened her journal again, discovering pages I hadn't noticed before. They contained detailed notes about this very garden, a place that existed simultaneously in our world and somewhere else, a sanctuary she had spent her life creating and protecting. The final entry was dated just days before her passing, and it was addressed to me. "My dearest grandchild," it read, "if you are reading this, then you have found your way into the garden beyond the thorns. This place has been in our family's care for generations, existing in the delicate space between dreams and waking. The flowers here bloom with the light of another world, and their song calls to those who have the ability to hear it. I have watched you grow, seeing in you the same connection to this place that I inherited from my own grandmother. The garden is yours now, to tend and protect, as it has always been meant to be." The journal continued with instructions for caring for the various otherworldly plants, but I found my attention drawn to the garden itself. In the soft blue light, I could see subtle movements among the flowers, the suggestions of shapes that were almost but not quite visible to the human eye. The entire garden seemed to pulse with a gentle rhythm, like slow, peaceful breathing. A warm breeze carried the sound of distant wind chimes, and I noticed that the floating gardening tools had begun to move with purpose, as if guided by unseen hands. They tended to the luminescent flowers with graceful precision, pruning and watering as needed. I realized that I was witnessing the garden's nocturnal maintenance, carried out by gardeners who existed just beyond the veil of ordinary perception. As I sat there, surrounded by the gentle music of glass-like flowers and the peaceful movements of invisible gardeners, I felt a deep sense of connection to this place and to my grandmother's legacy. The mystery of the garden beyond the thorns had not been solved so much as it had expanded, inviting me to become part of its ongoing story. Time moved differently here. What felt like minutes might have been hours as I sat on that bench, watching the interplay of light and shadow, listening to the crystalline music of the flowers. The rain had stopped completely now, and the night air was clear and sweet. Above the garden, stars twinkled in patterns that seemed subtly different from those visible in the ordinary world. Eventually, I made my way back along the moss-covered path toward the door in the wall of thorns. As I reached it, I turned for one last look at the extraordinary garden. In the soft blue light, I could have sworn I saw the outline of a familiar figure, small and slightly stooped, wearing my grandmother's favorite gardening hat, moving among the luminescent flowers. The figure raised a hand in greeting, or perhaps farewell, before fading into the gentle glow of the garden's night-blooming wonders. Back in my grandmother's study, I carefully placed the journal on her desk, noting how the brass key seemed to shimmer with a faint blue light of its own. The sound of chimes still echoed in my memory, along with the sweet scent of those otherworldly flowers. I knew that this was just the beginning of my journey with the garden beyond the thorns, a place where the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary had grown wonderfully, mysteriously thin. Outside the study window, the wall of thorns stood as it always had, revealing nothing of the wonders it concealed. But now I knew what lay beyond it, and I understood that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but rather experienced, nurtured, and passed on to those who can hear the delicate music of flowers that bloom in the spaces between worlds. Story 10. The ancient stone house stood silently in the evening mist, its weathered walls embracing decades of untold stories. As I approached the entrance, my footsteps softly crunching against the gravel path, the sweet scent of autumn leaves filled my lungs. The air held that peculiar stillness that comes just before winter, when nature seems to pause and take a deep breath. I had inherited this place from my grandmother, though I'd never visited during her lifetime. The lawyer's letter arrived 3 weeks ago, bringing with it memories of her gentle voice telling me stories over the phone about the house where she'd spent her final years. Now, as I stood before the heavy wooden door, key in hand, I couldn't help but wonder about all the things she never had the chance to tell me. The brass key turned smoothly in the lock, as if the house had been expecting me. The door's hinges whispered a quiet greeting, releasing a rush of cool air that carried the faint aroma of old books and lavender. Inside, the foyer was bathed in the soft amber glow of sunset filtering through stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the hardwood floors. My footsteps echoed gently as I moved through the space, each room revealing itself like pages in a forgotten storybook. The furniture wore white sheets like graceful ghosts, and dust motes danced in the dying sunlight. Everything felt perfectly preserved, as though time had simply decided to flow around this place rather than through it. In the living room, a grandfather clock marked the seconds with a gentle heartbeat rhythm that seemed to sync with my own. The mantelpiece held a collection of old photographs in silver frames, their subjects gazing out with serene expressions. As I studied them, something caught my attention. In each photo, a peculiar pattern of light appeared, like a soft luminescent mist hovering near the subjects. At first, I dismissed it as age damage to the photographs, but the consistency was striking. The kitchen retained traces of my grandmother's presence, dried herbs hanging from ceiling beams, collections of teacups arranged by color, and handwritten recipes yellowed with age. As I ran my fingers along the smooth marble countertop, a subtle vibration seemed to travel through my fingertips, almost like a quiet hum beneath the stone's surface. As evening deepened into night, I lit the old oil lamps I'd found, their warm glow creating pools of comfort in the growing darkness. The house creaked and settled around me, but rather than feeling unsettling, the sounds were oddly comforting, like listening to someone breathe in their sleep. That's when I first noticed the music. It was so faint that I initially thought it was just the wind finding its way through some hidden crack. But as I stood perfectly still, I could distinguish the delicate notes of what sounded like a music box. The melody was hauntingly familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very walls were humming a lullaby. I followed the sound up the curved staircase, my hand trailing along the smooth wooden banister. The second floor was a maze of corridors and closed doors, each one a mystery waiting to be explored. The music grew neither louder nor softer as I walked, maintaining its ethereal distance regardless of my location. In what must have been my grandmother's bedroom, I found her old vanity table, its mirror reflecting the lamplight in a way that seemed to double the room's depth. On its surface lay a single envelope addressed to me, the paper thick and cream-colored, my name written in her elegant script. As I sat on the edge of the bed to read it, the mattress sank beneath me with a soft sigh. The letter contained only a few lines. My dearest, the house has secrets it will share only with those who listen with their heart rather than their ears. When you hear the music, follow it, not with your feet, but with your memories. Remember the lullaby I used to sing to you over the phone? That's the key. All my love, Grandma. The music box melody suddenly clicked into place in my mind. It was indeed the lullaby she had sung to me countless times during our long-distance calls. As this recognition washed over me, the quality of the sound changed subtly, becoming clearer, more present. Rising from the bed, I began to hum along with the distant tune. The air around me seemed to thicken, and the lamplight took on an opalescent quality. In the vanity mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement. Not my own reflection, but something like heat waves rippling across water. Following my grandmother's advice, I closed my eyes and focused on the memory of her voice, letting it blend with the music box melody. The temperature in the room shifted, becoming noticeably warmer, and a gentle breeze that couldn't possibly have come from anywhere touched my face, carrying with it the scent of her perfume. When I opened my eyes, the mirror's surface had transformed. Instead of reflecting the bedroom, it showed scenes from my grandmother's life. Fleeting images of her as a young woman walking these same halls, tending to her herbs, reading by firelight. In each scene, she was surrounded by that same luminescent mist I'd noticed in the photographs. The visions were accompanied by whispered words that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. They spoke of the house's history, of the generations of women who had lived here before her, each adding their own layer of magic to the stone and wood. The house, I came to understand, was more than just a building. It was a repository of memories, dreams, and love, preserved like pressed flowers between its ancient pages. As the night deepened, I found myself sitting in a comfortable armchair by the window, watching as the mist outside grew thicker. occasionally taking shapes that seemed almost human. The music box melody had become a constant companion, weaving itself into the fabric of my consciousness. I discovered that by focusing on different memories of my grandmother, I could guide the mirror's visions, exploring the house's past through her experiences. Sometimes I caught glimpses of other figures, perhaps the previous inhabitants, their forms gentle and non-threatening, like watercolor paintings coming to life. The house revealed its secrets slowly, like a flower opening its petals to the morning sun. Each revelation was subtle, a hidden drawer containing old letters, a pattern in the wooden floorboards that shifted when viewed from different angles, the way certain rooms seemed larger on the inside than their external dimensions would allow. Most intriguing were the moments when past and present appeared to overlap. In the kitchen, I would sometimes hear the phantom clinking of teacups and smell fresh-baked bread. In the library, books would mysteriously open to pages containing messages that seemed meant specifically for me, offering wisdom and comfort in my grandmother's voice. As dawn approached, I found myself back in the bedroom, watching the sky lighten through the leaded glass windows. The music had faded to a barely perceptible whisper, but I could still feel it resonating within me. The mirror now showed only my own reflection, but something about it seemed different, as if I too was now part of the house's ongoing story. Looking at my grandmother's letter again, I noticed words appearing beneath her signature, written in the same silvery mist that had surrounded her in the photographs. The house chooses its own family. Welcome home, my dear one. I understood then that I hadn't simply inherited a house. I had been given custody of a living history, a place where memory and magic intertwined like vines growing through ancient stone. The secret wasn't something to be discovered and exposed, but rather a continuing story to be lived and added to, one gentle night at a time. As I settled into bed, the music box melody returned, soft and sweet, singing me to sleep like a familiar lullaby. The house settled around me with a contentment I could feel in my bones, and I knew that this was just the beginning of our story together. In the days and weeks that followed, I would discover many more of the house's secrets, each one unfolding with the same peaceful mystery as that first night. But those are stories for another time, waiting to be whispered in the space between sleeping and waking, where magic still lingers in the corners of old stone houses and in the memories of those who know how to listen.